In the early morning hours of July 4th, the Guadalupe River in Texas rose 26 feet in just 45 minutes. Families were asleep. Some had no cell phones, either by choice, enjoying time unplugged, or because there was no service in the remote hill country. When the water came, it came fast. Too fast. And for those of us in Louisiana, the heartbreak hits hard because we have lived it. In 2016, a slow moving storm dumped trillions of gallons of rain over South Louisiana. It was not a hurricane, it had no name, and still it swallowed neighborhoods whole, wiped out entire communities. 13 people died. Tens of thousands of people lost everything, and many of them never got a warning either. The parallels are eerie. Flash flooding in places that are considered safe, families caught off guard, rescue boats where school buses should be. And now, another southern state is asking the same questions we asked nearly a decade ago. Why did we not see this coming? Why were people not warned? And how do you rebuild when no one was prepared? I'm Kiran Chawla, and this is Louisiana Unfiltered. Today, we are diving into the rising waters in Texas and back home. What connects these tragedies? What has or has not changed? And what happens when nature outpaces every system built to stop it? Welcome back, everyone. This week we are joined by our executive producer, Daniel Brown. Daniel, thank you for joining us. This one's a tough one.
It's a very tragic story that kind of brought back a lot of memories from nearly a decade ago for a lot of people here in Louisiana. Very different circumstances, but very similar at the same time.
Yes. I guess, Daniel, let's kind of start with setting the scene. And to me, two of the worst things in this specific case are that it's a holiday weekend. So lots and lots of tourists and even the camp that was going on for the holiday. But number two, it was in the very early morning hours when a lot of people were still asleep.
They were, and I spent a lot of time in Texas for part of my career, and this is a area, the hill country of Texas. It literally is the heart of Texas. A lot of people travel to this area, like you said, for holidays. The Guadalupe River is very popular for not only RVs but for tents and hiking and all these things. And one of the things that's been getting a lot of attention are a lot of the summer camps in the area. There are a ton of summer camps that are all right here, and this was all kind of like a recipe for disaster in a lot of ways. It was this perfect storm, the timing, everything, just to kind of create this tragic incident with more than 100 people losing their lives because of a flood.
And it's like you said, Daniel, that for me, it's so much of the PTSD. And I say me, I speak for a lot of people in South Louisiana that we understand it a little bit maybe better than the rest of the country can. I know that everybody's hearts are pouring out, especially for those little girls. But everybody right now, this is the big story nationally that is unfolding. But for Louisiana, especially South Louisiana, the Baton Rouge metro area, should I say, we understand it a tad bit better because I remember a councilwoman told me this years ago, Daniel, that when your own feet burn, you actually understand the pain of how much it hurts to suffer from a burn rather than just hearing it from someone that they're struggling from the pain of a burn. And those words hold so true that once you've lived through something, you've been there, you get it. And in this case, a lot of people here have been there. I know I was there. For the longest time, if it rained real heavy, still in my head, we're flooding.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I know we're going to dive into the comparisons, but I guess first we want to kind of set the scene and talk about the exact details of what all happened in this specific flood.
It was 100 billion gallons of water. That's more than what the Niagara Falls produces in a day that kind of fell in this area. And it's one of those numbers. When I read it, I had to reread it a few times because it's like 100 billion gallons. Like, how do you kind of equate that? And it's basically the volume of water that poured down from the rain. And that's kind of what it's estimating. It led to 10 to 12 inches of rain falling in just a few hours, which is a awful lot of water. The Guadalupe River rose 26 feet in 45 minutes. And you mentioned it happened overnight. This was at 4 in the morning. So this was something that no one really saw coming. It was literally a wall of water that hit this specific area of Texas. And it happened in the middle of the night. It happened in an area that doesn't have great cell phone towers, so there's not a lot of so cell phone signals and all that kind of impacted getting warnings out. It also, we mentioned all the summer camps and stuff in the area. A lot of these summer camps, what I've been reading is the kids actually surrender their cell phones at the beginning of the camp. It's an unplugged. A lot of these are like unplugged. It's meant to kind of have kids connect and not be tied to the devices and stuff like that. So a lot of the kids didn't have their cell phones with them. So all of this kind of combined, and this was one where, you know, there were warnings, and this is, flash flood alley that's been kind of out there in the news, and this is an area that's prone to flooding. But Karen, what I found interesting in I guess covering news for as long as we have, it's one of those things where you don't think about it until you think about it. But I feel like flood watches, flood warnings, flash floods are one of the most ignored weather alerts that we have.
Yep.
I think people think that, oh, you'll have time to react. You can kind of see it coming. This was one of those instances where that wasn't the case. You literally have a wall of water, 100 billion gallons of water coming at you in just a few hours. You don't really see that coming. It's one of those things where you can't really forecast. And I know the forecasters have been getting a lot of blame for not getting it right or missing it. This was forecast, but it's hard to forecast something that you don't even think is fathomable at the same time, in a lot of ways.
Yep.
So all these things are kind of at play, and their rescuers are still combing through the debris. This is, you know, an area like the death toll is so massive that you forget about all the homes and stuff that are also ravaged. But there are, if you see any of the pictures of the aftermath, I mean, there are RVs and cars. There's just mangled wreckage and debris kind of on the riverbanks here. I was listening to an interview with one of the rescuers who was combing through the riverbanks looking for bodies, and they said that you could hear cell phones kind of going off along the riverbeds just for people that just haven't been located yet. So it's one of those things where it's hard to kind of wrap your head around just how massive this tragedy actually is.
Yeah. And I'll even say this, it's July 4th weekend. A lot of people do like to be on the water, near
Yeah,
the waters, in some way, shape, or form. Especially in the South, we like to be on the water.
yeah,
And that does, if your kids aren't already at camps, maybe you as your family have decided you're going on the lake, you are taking your RV out. I know we have a camper and we camp often, and I prefer to be somewhere along the water. But Daniel, there was a time lapse here, a video time lapse, of course, and we kind of can't show it in an audio version, but
yeah,
there is a video time lapse of people standing on almost a little bridge area.
yep,
And within just, like you said, that 45 minutes, the first responders go back a little, a little, a little, a little. And I would love to talk to those first responders that did they even know what was happening? Yes, they probably saw their phones, but did it register for them that, wait, this is the river that's rising? And in that time lapse, Daniel, you see that water come up so fast. But then there was a really good visual that one of the outlets did to show that after it stayed about this high, it was the river itself that, even though it wasn't coming up higher here, it kept rising up to 26 feet. And like you
Yep.
said, 45 minutes. And I know we're going to get into the warnings and the breakdown of all of that, but let's be honest, Daniel. The you and I, all of our staff, all of our area, Alexa speaks, hey, warning for your area. The cell phone dings, emergency warning. And how often do we look at it and say, oh, okay, cool. And you go right back to cooking dinner or whatever you're doing. But in this case, it's 4 o'clock in the morning and you're asleep. What do you do?
And this is an area too that is prone to flash flood. So they're used to flooding. They're not used to this, but they're used to flooding. So when they get the warnings, it's not that they weren't alert or aware or just purely ignoring it, but it's hard to fathom this happening when you're kind of used to the worst case scenario before. You have that in your head, so you feel like you and your family are safe because this area hasn't flooded. But then something like this happens and you're not, and that's what really reminds me of 2016. It's all the people are like, oh, I didn't flood in 89, or I didn't flood during whatever year it was. And you have this like notion that you're safe, and you're not. And Mother Nature always prevails. And, one of the things spending time too in Texas, Kieran, that I didn't appreciate until I lived there, to be quite honest, but summer camps are literally a way of life there. It's so different than Louisiana. Like, these are generations of families. Like, their moms and dads went to summer camps. They became camp counselors, and now their kids are going to the same camps. And it's a really big deal in Texas. And we're talking about hundreds of campers at these camps. It's almost kind of like what you see in the movies when they have summer camp. Kind of going back to
Yes.
some of the Parent Trap, or some of the Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen kind of movies where they're at summer camp. That's what it is. And I always thought that was like, oh, just for movies, but that literally is what they have in Texas. And it's such a rite of passage for so many kids and families in this area, that it truly is part of the culture there.
In fact, Daniel, you say that, and Camp Mystique, there were 750 girls at this camp. Now, you got to remember, there are still some missing. There are some who did not survive.
Yep.
But I saw, speaking of what you just said as far as generational, that former First Lady Bush, she went to this camp. And then to add to that, the last time the Guadalupe River kind of rose was 1987. And I know one of the major networks, I can't remember which one,
It
but
was
they
NBC,
actually
yeah.
they shared their original story they did from then, and then they interviewed some of the girls who were
Mhm.
rescued from Camp Mystique. Mind you, those girls by now have to be around 50 years old. Talk about PTSD, but they survived. A lot of those girls, thankfully, were rescued. And in this case, from what I understand, is that the one of the area where like the 8 and 9 year old girls were housed was maybe a football field's distance from the river itself. And again, if you look at that time lapse, that water didn't slowly rise. It was just the wall came at you. And yeah, it's immediately going to wash away that spot first. The girls a little bit higher may have had a quick chance, but we're hearing the horror stories come out that the counselors did their best to kind of get everybody out. But how does even a counselor, in the seconds it took for that water to rise, get those girls to safety?
Yeah, it's one of those things you train for. It's kind of like teachers training for active shooter drills and stuff like that. But when it actually happens, one of the interesting things that I saw, they think that a lot of the kids were saved because a lot of the counselors, since there's so many kids, not everyone works every single day. You have like days off. Some of the counselors that have days off, their curfew is like 1 a.m., I think is what I heard in one of the interviews. So some of them were just coming back to the camp as the rivers were starting to rise. The river was starting to rise. So they were able to kind of alert and start moving some of these kids, and getting some waking some of the other counselors up and getting them to action, moving into action to kind of start moving some of the kids. And it's it's interesting that that could have been what saved even more lives, because there's a lot of these little bitty cabins and stuff that were close to the river, and a lot of them were evacuated. Obviously, there was several kids that weren't so fortunate and lucky.
No.
But you just kind of think like right place, right time for some of these counselors to kind of jump into action and start evacuating and moving. And then the the owner of the camp, I mean, he lost his life trying to save the kids. And I was listening to a lot of interviews with kids that have gone to this camp, and Jenna Bush Hager was talking about, she didn't go to this camp, but you mentioned her mom did, and but she grew up going to summer camp, and she just dropped her kids off to a different summer camp, and she was talking about, this camp director. He's like a second dad to a lot of these girls, and he taught a lot of these girls how to fish and how to do all these things. So he lost his life trying to save so many of these young girls.
It hurts. It, it reminds me of 2016 here. And I remember, Daniel, that I was a reporter back then. And so many of us, as a reporter, you don't just live in these communities. I know I don't. Often, yeah, you do move around. You work in a city and then you move on. This Baton Rouge is my home and I've lived it. And in that moment, you're not just a reporter, you're a resident of the community and you're watching your loved ones suffer. And in this case, I guess it's like you said, that
And you
eerie
have these
similarity.
and you have it in your head, and this goes back to 2016. I remember my family flooded in 2016, and it was one of those things we've never flooded before, and it's something you'll be hearing a lot about in the news. But like the once in a generation storm, or the once in every 100-year storm kind of thing, or 1,000-year storm. Um, it that always goes back to, I could still hear my dad, oh, well, the water's going to stop. It's never flooded our house. It's never going to get there. And you keep watching the water get closer and closer and closer. But you have this like preconceived notion of safety in your head. Like it's never gotten that high before. So you kind of let your guard down a little bit until it's almost too late. And Texas was so different because 2016, the water rose fast, but it didn't rise anywhere near as fast as like this did in Texas. Like it's one of those things that's hard to wrap your head around, just how fast that water rose and how high it got. You mentioned it didn't just overflow the banks; it went up,
Yeah.
above roofs, like houses and all that. So you put that into some perspective. It's interesting because I was in Texas in 2019 when we flooded there, and it was one of those things where, again, we've never flooded where I was located. I was working at a TV station there, and that station never flooded before. So we thought we were safe. We had plans in motion and all that. But then you're watching the water rise and rise and rise, and we barely were able to evacuate because we waited so long. Because it was one of those things where you're listening to people that have lived through other flood events in the town, and it's never gotten that high, so you're kind of listening to them, but then you're watching the water, and then it's almost too late. And then and that's a lot of what happened here,
Yep.
in a more significant magnitude.
And I apologize. I guess for me, it brings back living in that very moment of, are
Yeah.
you staying or are you going? The river, I mean, I say river. Well, yeah, it was the river. It was the A meet for us.
Yeah.
But that it was coming up so fast. And I still remember it was 10:30 at night for a majority of Livingston Parish. That it was nighttime for people. And yeah, there are people who go to bed by 10:30, you're in bed. A lot of people are already asleep because the next day for us in Louisiana, we thought we had work. It was a weeknight. And I guess I go back to that and I remember just having to evacuate in the quick minute that we had, the few minutes we had to hurry up. You save your life or do you save the materialistic things? No, you just get yourselves out and go. That's how fast it came. But
Yeah.
Daniel, I had that quick 5 minutes. I had that 4 or 5 minutes of, okay, let me hurry up and throw a few things in a bag because I don't know what we're coming home to, how long we're going to be gone. I had those 4 or 5 minutes. These people maybe had seconds for this wall to just come at them. And I guess that's what hurts. But you got to remember, it's Louisiana. We've also been through Katrina.
Yeah.
I've lived that too. People say Katrina was a once in a lifetime time storm. Lived it, worked it.
Yeah.
2016 was a once in a lifetime storm. Lived it and worked it as well. And I pray there's nothing else that happens. But I guess that's why I can say that here in Louisiana, we understand what our Texas neighbors are going through probably better than anyone. But Daniel, I'll also add this: the stories of Louisianians jumping up and hooking that boat to a trailer and going. They don't care. They're going. The
Yeah.
rescues that come out of this. And now what we're seeing is the donations, the drives that come through. This isn't something that's going to be done in another day or two. Louisiana's going to be right there helping our Texan neighbors for the months that are ahead. You're going to see the Habitat for Humanity's coming in to help aid and rebuild homes, because that's what we received in 2016. That's what we received in 2005. And Louisianians, we give back.
In 2016 there was 13 people who died in the flood here in Louisiana. So, you know, we're not comparing the two, and I think it's important that we say that because you have more than 100 people dead in Texas, 27 just at that one camp that we talked about, Camp Mystic. So 13 lives here, that was more than, the camp had more than that. So these events are not the same, but it does bring up those, like you keep saying, the same memories. And, you know, this is a story too that was, you covered this, I know, and I felt it. Like Louisiana was really forgotten in 2016 because it was not a named storm. The national media took them a really long time to even kind of cover it, and then even then it was just kind of like a blip. It wasn't like you're seeing in Texas, but in Texas, in a lot of ways, it was kind of overlooked for a while too because it happened over a holiday weekend. Not a lot of people were paying attention. The magnitude is obviously putting the spotlight on it this week. And rightfully so. But this tragedy in Texas brought back some of that feeling of being overlooked and kind of forgotten. And it's kind of like the wildfires in California earlier this year. Like how many we've moved on two lifetimes since then, it feels like, in our own personal lives, and these people are still rebuilding. And it's gonna be the same thing in Texas. It was the same thing here in Louisiana. It took years for families to rebuild and stuff like that. So it's important to talk about it from that point of view too, to your point, Kiran, because
Yep.
these are lives that are impacted. And while the death tolls aren't the same and the exact storm's not the same, there's a lot of those parallels there.
And by no doubt, let me second what you were saying. Am I sitting here trying to compare the two? I guess what I'm saying is that we can understand it. I get teary eyed. Because I go back to not knowing where I'm going. What am I doing? But I'm alive. I walked out alive.
Yep.
But I remember getting those calls as one of our loved ones, we didn't know where they were. We couldn't get in touch with them, that there's no cell phone coverage. That alone is just that emotional stress and toll of not knowing if your loved one is alive. And in this case, you've got little girls. I pray for those parents every night because what do you do, Daniel?
You know,
What do
and
you even say? There's nothing to say. There are no words that can bring back a child or any loved one for that matter, but we've all heard it. Parents aren't meant to outlive their kids.
yeah, and you brought up such a valid point. And this one camp is getting a lot of attention because of the specific death toll. There were other camps nearby that were also impacted. Like I mentioned, like there are so many camps in this area, summer camps in this area. They had some that was kind of a boys and girls kind of camp, and they had two brothers who one was younger than the other by like 2 years or something. So they were in different parts of the camp, but they were both at the camp together. And the older brother was just trying to figure out how to get to his younger brother because he didn't want him to be alone. And then you had the sisters who were at one camp, and they were found several miles downriver, like still holding hands, and they had died together holding hands. And so many of these stories, and this other mom was recounting her daughter at the camp, and her best friend got swept away like right in front of her by the floodwaters, and there's nothing you can do, and
Nothing.
it's fight or flight kind of mentality here, and you're just trying to get to safety, but all this is happening around you. Like it's hard to kind of picture. It literally is like a Hollywood horror movie of what was going on with this water and the chaos and that kind of enveloped these kids. You know.
I guess, Daniel, let's talk about those warnings. And I remember watching some of these press conferences. I guess being a reporter, you watch it in two ways. I think you know what I'm saying. You watch it from the aspect of the professional, but then you're still taking in the how big this tragedy is. And I remember one of those press conferences, kind of like you said, that the national media, it took them a minute. It took them a minute to get there. And then when the press conferences started happening, and this may have been the very first one with the governor involved and the defense secretary was present there, but they caught a lot of heat about the warnings and were they actually issued. But now in the last, or in this week, should I say, we have seen that they started earlier, but it was around 1 o'clock in the morning, kind of like you said, that some of those counselors were coming in at that time, that the first of the really serious warnings kind of kicked off.
Yeah, look, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback this, and it's easy to kind of go back now and look at it and the finger pointing and the political blame game. Like, I we're putting me and you were putting that aside. We went and found just the pure facts about when the weather warnings kind of started. And they started on July 1st. The National Weather Service in San Antonio and Austin, they began highlighting the potential for flooding as early as that Tuesday. Okay. So that was July 1st. On July 3rd, there was a flood watch was issued by the National Weather Service. It included Kerr County. That was also where the bulk of the flooding happened. That's where at least 80 plus of the 100 deaths happened. So the majority of them were in Kerr County. And it highlighted the potential for up to 7 inches of rain. So that was the day before on July 3rd. At 6:10 later that day on July 3rd, there was a rare special weather discussion that emphasized worsening trends. So these forecast models are constantly updating. The computer models are coming together. They use words in this discussion concerning trends, flash flooding likely, and rainfall rates exceeding 3 inches per hour. And those words are interesting because, again, this is Flash Flood Alley. This is an area that's used to flash flooding. So they were really specific on the words they used, which I think is important to point out. That was at 6:10 p.m. At 1:14 in the morning on July 4th, this was Friday, the flood warning was issued for Kerr County. It was the first official warning. It had what's considered in the National Weather Service is called a considerable tag. And that's used for significant and potentially life-threatening flash floods. And that word is what triggers the wireless emergency alerts on mobile phones and stuff like that. So when I say words matter, that's why I'm pointing some of these out. That's a word that matters. What's interesting, and we talked a little bit about this, Kiran, but it's unclear about cell coverage in the area and how it's impacted. This is a rural area. You have a lot of people camping. And that's another reason why they don't know how high the death toll is going to be, because they don't know exactly how many people were in the area, because it was a lot of tent camping and RV camping and all that. It wasn't just these summer camps. It was just recreational, in cabins that you can rent and stuff like that. So they don't even know how many people were in the area. But cell phone service was impacted. But at 1:14 in the morning, that's when a lot of these alerts were starting to trigger. So your cell phones are going off in the middle of the night and stuff like that. And we mentioned that summer camp, all the kids surrendered their cell phones. So none of the kids had cell phones. It was only probably the counselors and stuff like that. And even then there's questions about how many of the counselors had cell phones and whatnot.
And Daniel, let me even add this, that I know this from experience as well. When we're camping, you know this, there are a lot of times a lot of these campgrounds have zero service. I have to
Zero
let you
service.
know, hey, I'm headed back to the campground.
Yeah,
I will not have service. This is
correct.
right along the river. And like I said, that's where you want to be camping. And I've seen these pictures of the camper literally swept away, but then a tree finally stops them. That camper is wrapped around that tree. If
Yep.
you're in your bed asleep, even if somehow you ended up staying in that camper, that river water came up so fast, it was flooding or you're dying just from the impact.
Correct.
And that just adds to, we don't know what the count's going to be just yet because there's no check-in required at some of these primitive campgrounds. You just go set up your camper or your tent and you're good.
And that's what happened here, and you mentioned the RVs, the mangled metal. I mean, the riverbanks of the Guadalupe are just littered with these, and it's not only like litter and debris, it's RVs and tents and all these other things that are kind of there. So that's what the rescue teams are having to kind of dig through to find the bodies, which is even more sad. It
Yep.
was an hour later that the National Weather Service reported that up to 5 inches of rain had already fallen. So this is at about 2:30 in the morning. Conditions in Kerr County suggested that flash flooding had already begun. So at this time, the area was beginning to flood. 5 inches of rain had already fallen in that area, which is a lot of water. It was 30 minutes later at 3:02 in the morning. A subsequent communication by the National Weather Service was issued that a dangerous flash flood event was unfolding in south central Kerr County. So this was when all hell was breaking loose, to be quite honest.
And Daniel,
Um,
going back to what you said, that words matter. From everything I understand, that warning at 3 o'clock that came out is a very, very, very rare warning from the National Weather Service.
yeah, and a lot of these were rare. They're not issued very often. Um, the flash flood emergency was declared, like you said, rarely issued. It's the most serious alert level that the National Weather Service has. And so it's not like, just like you mentioned, it's not one that's used a lot. Um, and the flash flood warning system, it's reserved for, and I looked it up on the National Weather Service's website. It's reserved only for the most life threatening and catastrophic flooding events. Only a small percentage of warnings reach this level. And they were even having some National Weather Service scientists and meteorologists go in and find out how often it was used. And they were having trouble because it's not used very often.
That
So that's
speaks
how
volumes.
that speaks volumes. Um, the Guadalupe, so that was at 4:03 a.m. At 4:20 in the morning. This was near Hunt, Texas. The Guadalupe River surged past this major flood stage. The major flood stage is 22 feet. The river crested at 29.45 feet at 4:35 in the morning. So it was well above considered major flood stage. And the speed and magnitude of the rising water is what you saw in like in the time lapse video and stuff that
Time
you kind of
lapse.
mentioned. Again, the Guadalupe River rose 26 feet in 45 minutes.
Let that sink in.
That's a lot, like 26 feet, because the Houston Chronicle's done a great job of investigating this, and they've done some really great work, and the camps in the area have river gauges, and the river was not considered any remotely high. It wasn't even considered at an alarming level. It wasn't even at a level that would draw kind of look. So that's how fast this water rose and how much water kind of fell in this area.
And Daniel, we both work in media. We've got meteorologists who are friends. And having these conversations with them, the truth is, no human being, I don't care how great of a meteorologist you are, there is no human being out there who could have predicted what was coming. This is Mother Nature. And a lot of our local people have compared it to 2016, that they had a feeling. They knew that 2016 was going to be problematic. They had no idea what would come because you cannot predict ahead of time, hey, 7 inches of rain are going to fall in 2 hours.
Correct.
It's a matter of just, it literally forms over us. And prime example, Walker may get 10 inches of rain. Well, in fact, let's go to Texas. Kerr County or Sevier, something along those lines, I think got 26 inches or 20 plus inches. And then there were other parts of town that got the 7 to 8 inches. But you got to remember, the river is going through multiple counties. And in fact, you said it, Kerr County was one of the most impacted, the
It
most
was.
significant. But there are death tolls coming in from 6 areas
Six
six
counties.
main counties, should I say, in that specific area. But that Guadalupe River, it's not just staying in Kerr County. It's going through all these areas, kind of like the Amite River. And going back, I guess you can compare it because personal experience. I remember, Daniel, in 2016, we went and interviewed Congressman Graves back then, right along the banks of the Amite River. And I remember both of us looking at it before we went live saying, wow, that's actually pretty high. But I'm standing in somebody's backyard.
Yeah.
The river was fine at that very moment. It was that night that we called it a night for the day. We had been reporting all day. We went back. We thought we were about to go to bed. And that's when everything happened, that the river rose from where we were standing to well over the height of that house in the backyard that I did that interview at.
Yeah, meteorologists get such a bad rep. I mean, they are forecasting the future, and in my opinion, only God can kind of do that, right?
Yep.
It's hard. They knew it was going to be a flooding event. They warned of flooding event several days in advance. They did not warn to this magnitude. But again, you have moisture from the Pacific, moisture from the Gulf, and then you had remnants of a hurricane that hit, or a tropical storm that hit Mexico days before, that just kind of all assembled over this one area. It's kind of hard to kind of forecast that happening. It really is. And Kiran, we spent a lot of time talking about the cell phone warnings. What's so interesting, and this is where change is going to happen, and we saw a lot of change after 2016. In this area, there are parts of the Guadalupe that flooded, that where some of the RVs and tents are, that have these warning systems. It's basically like sirens or horns that kind of sound to kind of alert people. And they had them in different parts of the Guadalupe River. They did not have them in Kerr County, where the bulk of the tragedy happened. And I mentioned the Houston Chronicle doing a lot of investigating. This was one of the investigations they did, and this is one where they've been fighting for 8 years for a flood warning system in this specific area. And it comes down to basically dollars, and they didn't have the funding for it. They didn't have the $1 million that it was going to cost for this warning system, so it never became a reality. And now the Texas session's about to start later this month, and that's obviously going to be something that lawmakers are going to have to decide and find the funding for. But that's one of the system failures here.
And it's a
You know,
major system failure.
and the other thing, and you're a camper, and I don't know if you have one of these, but one of the National Weather Service radios, that's why those are so important, because even if you don't have cell phone service, these radios will kind of go off with warnings. I can still hear Jake Grimes preaching about these weather radios, and having them, and why they're so important, because they're battery operated. They're not reliant on cell phone signal and stuff like that, and they will alert you. So if you're in a remote area or camping, or even if you're in your house and you lose power or your cell phone dies, you'll still get weather alerts. And we talk about hurricanes you see coming days ahead of time. Even tornadoes now, you have
A little bit of
significant
warning.
warning.
Yep.
Maybe not exactly where the tornado is going to be, but the atmosphere is ripe for a tornado. This flooding, you knew about it, but again, you didn't know how bad it was going to be. And that's why those weather radios are just so important to have. And it, it could have saved so many lives, just having the warning system or having those radios kind of nearby.
Well, and Daniel, I want to add 2 points to what all you just said. It kind of goes back a little bit, just a tad, that I know there's, in the day and age we live in, rumors get started really, really, really quickly that the National Weather Service wasn't prepared. They actually had brought in extra staff to work this because that's how worried they were about this. Again, it happened overnight though. And that's the part that's going to be really difficult. The other thing, Daniel, is we semi discussed it already, but there's a certain amount of fatigue when it comes to these warnings and watches that, like we already said, we look at it, oh, that's not us. But I wonder how many people at that 3, 4 o'clock alert that did go out that requires the cell phone alert for people who had a phone, number one, and number two, actually had service to receive it. How many of those people probably looked at it and said, oh, okay, I'm going back to sleep?
Yeah,
And
because
that's if you had the phone and had service. There were so many others, you're in a remote location, you didn't get service. I
well, it
mean,
goes
you
back
didn't
to
get
what
the
we're
alert.
talking about. You've never flooded before. You get these, but you still don't think it's going to happen to you, kind of thing. And that's an important point, and it's also weather warnings are so hard. And Kieran, we've talked about this for other kind of things about disaster prep. We live in an area that has like a lot of plants. So if there's a plant explosion or emission of something dangerous, the time it takes to trigger these alerts sometimes is not a lot of time, and it takes time to get these out. And it goes back to these weather alerts. And there was some. I was reading some discussions online between some meteorologists that were just talking about it. And to trigger these alerts is a process. It's not just someone typing it in and clicking a button. It's a discussion. It's a process, because we talked about the language that was used is so specific, and what it triggered, and all that. So you want to be careful, because you don't want to cry wolf too many times and not happen, because then people, and we see this in hurricanes all the time, that don't heed the evacuation warnings or don't heed how bad the storm is. Oh, well, the other storm was worse than this one, so we'll be fine, kind
We'll
of
be
thing. And
fine.
it's kind of like the flood things. Oh, we've had bad floods before, slash flood alley. We're used to that. This is our way of life here. And then something like this happens, and you're kind of caught off guard. And these alerts are kind of part of that. It's not just hitting enter on a keyboard. It's a lot that goes into it. And I think every time these happen, I wish more cities and officials would kind of take a look at their emergency preparations, and what does work and what does not work. And Kirk County did have an alert, that you could sign up for. Code Red's what it was called, but you had to go in and actually sign up for it. And a lot of areas in Louisiana have similar kind of things if cities can afford them. There's smaller communities that can't afford that, though, that they can't afford the technology and the upkeep, and all of the subscription that comes to kind of do this. But there's so many of these things that could save lives, and I think about that. I think about when something does happen at a plant, or if there is a flood or a tornado or a hurricane, and these things happen, like, how are you going to get information? Who's going to tell me, and who's responsible for that?
Well, and I go back and compare it. I remember when I was working in Marksville, drawing a blank which parish that is.
Boils?
Yes, in Avoyles Parish, and we were doing live shots right at noon. And the very first time it kicked off, it scared me, and I didn't know what to do. But they test their sirens, their emergency
Yeah.
sirens, at noon every Friday.
Yeah.
And in my head, I'm thinking, why does Avoyles Parish need sirens? I still don't know that answer, but maybe if Kerr County had something
Mhm.
similar, I would have woke up to that. And again, I put myself in these people's shoes that if I was camping along the river, that at 4 o'clock in the morning, if I'm hearing a siren going off, I'm waking up to that.
And the
So
sirens upriver did sound, and it did alert people, so they do work, and
yes,
yeah, they
yes.
do work.
So to me, and this is Kiran Chawla talking, this is not the reporter in me saying this. I personally just feel something along those lines. I get it. A lot of cities don't have the money, the jurisdictions don't have the money, but maybe it's time for our federal, local, state officials to sit down and how much, what value do you put on one human life? And maybe that could have saved something. And like you said, Daniel, we're all sitting here Monday morning quarterbacking, and I, I don't know. Things do need to change. And I guess that leads us into the next thing. What has changed? What hasn't changed? And maybe what changes do need to come.
The FEMA response has gotten much better, and we've seen that dramatically improve since Katrina, when so many people were desperate for federal assistance and help, and it took days and weeks to come. You know, disaster since have learned a lot from Katrina. We learned something from every disaster. Um, Texas learned a lot from Harvey. This disaster will now be worse than what Harvey caused, as far as destruction and death toll. Um, so you learn a lot from that. The federal response was really quick to get aid in. The state response was really quick. I think the state of Texas learned a lot from Harvey as well, just like Louisiana learned a lot from Katrina. So I feel like the response to get boots on the ground and get resources into areas has improved tenfold dramatically since Katrina.
I'll agree with that. And I'll even say that technology has
Yeah.
improved a lot since these floods, since Katrina, since the 2016 flood, or even Harvey.
Yeah, we didn't have social media then.
No.
You know, social media really puts the pressure on getting some of these responses into cities and towns quicker. It also allows stories to come out, so you can kind of tug on the heartstrings of how you're impacted, and that's how dollars kind of get flowing in to kind of help and nonprofits and charities and all that kind of stuff. So that part did, and the governor and lieutenant governor in Texas said that they're committed to finding the funding to kind of get these warning systems up. So, I mentioned their session's about to start, so it'll be interesting to kind of see how that was. But this was something that nobody saw coming, so it does take time to activate resources and get things moving. But they did have helicopters in the air really quick looking for survivors, and the Coast Guard was quick to kind of jump into action to save people. So I feel like the response times have just every time we have a disaster of some sort, they dramatically improve.
I will absolutely agree with that. But I'll say this, Daniel. It's kind of like I said that Katrina was a once in a lifetime storm. So that means in my lifetime, I should not have had any other storms. 2016 was a once in a lifetime storm. Okay, well, that's two right there. So we keep hearing, hey, once in a thousand year flood, once in a 100-year flood, once in a lifetime. But are these happening more often now?
It feels like they are, and you have a lot of scientists, and this brings up the debate about climate change, and the impact that's having on our weather. You know, you don't have to buy into the politics of global warming or climate change to see that there is climate change happening. You can disagree about the reasonings, you can disagree about the politics of it, but it's hard to disagree with climate change is happening. We're seeing these events happen more and more often. The climates that we're used to are different, they're changing. So you are hearing about these more often, and look, I'm a believer in science. I just am, and I go back to people that I trust. Jay Grimes being one of them, and it it's you hear him talk about it, and it just makes sense, right? It's the argument about it doesn't make sense, but the fact that it's happening does, and it's hard to kind of ignore everything happening around you to kind of see that.
Yep. And Jay Grimes, Daniel, I'm just going to, for a quick second, plug him. He's a name in South Louisiana that when Jay Grimes speaks up, when his sleeves are rolled up, Louisiana listens. So the fact that he says that, it carries a lot of weight. And just like you said, the way he explains it does. It makes a lot of sense. And times are changing, the climates are changing, but yes, not to get into the political side of it, but it does. It gets you questioning. There are hurricanes that are sometimes coming in stronger than we've ever even seen before, and these torrential rains that bring these massive floods that we have never seen before. But I'll say this, at the end of the day, my prayer is that I hope we all as a country, as a world even, are watching this and take away some lessons that how to prevent this forever happening again in our communities, not just in Texas, but I don't care if it's Rhode Island. I don't care if it's in Europe, wherever it might be, but something is learned from this to prevent it from happening in your communities, because Mother Nature is going to do what Mother Nature wants to do. And Mother Nature does not care where or when that happens. And then I guess the last thing that I'll even add on this is my prayers continue for all those people. You saw the raw emotion that it brings out in me 9 years later. I didn't watch my best friend die in front of my own eyes. You may not, as a human being, we can't remember what we did yesterday. Let's be honest. The truth is, and we're living in such a fast-paced world that you can't remember what you did yesterday. But we all remember where we were September 11th. You remember exactly where you were, Katrina, 2016. I remember it like it was yesterday, every second that happened. These people who lived this flood will never ever forget it, and you will never get that image out of your mind of watching your sister, your best friend, your whomever die in front of your own eyes. And I pray that there's some healing. Those parents who have lost their kids, my prayers will continue for those families. And just closure is not the right word, Daniel. I always say that you can't ever close that book. You have to live with that forever now. But I pray that they're able to even just begin the process to move on. And I'll even go further. Floods, they don't just take homes, they take peace of mind, they take normalcy. And for families in Texas right now, just like so many in Louisiana in 2016, every single thing changed in an instant. The water, it moved too fast. The warnings came too late. And now they're left with the same questions we once asked. Where do we go now? Who's going to help us? So if you're looking for a way to help, we're encouraging you to support verified organizations doing real on-the-ground work in Texas. There are groups that get resources to the right places quickly and with integrity. And you can find a list of vetted relief efforts in the show notes and on our website. Be extremely careful of fake organizations and where you donate your money. We ask you to share this episode, leave a review, subscribe so these conversations continue to reach the people who need them. It costs nothing, but it keeps these stories alive. Daniel, thank you for joining us. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening to Louisiana Unfiltered. I'm Kiran Chawla. We'll see you next week.